Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased that so many of you have chosen to join us on what in New York is a beautiful late summer afternoon, one of these rare days. In fact, it reminded me for Tom and Jean of exactly 50 years ago now. I started my Chinese at the place where you are seated right now, at the summer trimester at Stanford. Was the beginning of my now 50-year endeavor to master the Chinese language. I wonder what my teachers would say about my tones today. But I know the weather is great there, so I need not comment on it. I'm thrilled today to be talking about a book which I thoroughly enjoyed. Here it is. It's called Fateful Decisions, Choices That Will Shape China's Future. And in this environment, when there's so much discussion that lacks history, lacks analysis of data, lacks so much kind of understanding of China, this book is a must read. Both the editors and two of the contributors are with me today, which is Tom Fingar and Jean Oy. They have done truly a remarkable job in putting this book together. I think it will be a textbook for a course one day on modern China. And it really leaves the reader with, the subheading, the choices that will shape China's future, leads everyone, each of these chapters, it depends on what the Chinese do. And that is going to influence what US-China relations are, what China looks like going in the future. Jean is the William Haas Professor of Chinese Politics in the Department of Political Science, and he's Senior Fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. She directs the China program at the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center and is the Li Shaoqi Director of the Stanford Center at Peking University. If I went over all of her publications, we wouldn't have time for this program, especially if I combined them with Tom. Tom Fingar is the Shorenstein Distinguished Fellow in the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford. He previously was the first Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and concurrently was Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He had a long career before that in INR, Intelligence and Research at the State Department, and in many other kind of areas in the US government. If I went over all of his publications, then we would run over without even having a discussion. But I'd like to just start this with Jean, since you started this project. Talk about why this book, why now, and what message are you trying to leave with the readers? And then we'll go to Tom, who joined the project later on. But Jean, thank you so much. Love having an afternoon to spend, or an hour and 15 minutes to spend with you and Tom.
Well, first, Steve, thank you very much and the National Committee for having this on. And I hope that you are right, that this is going to turn into a textbook. Let me say that this volume started as really an effort to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the China program at APARC. And so this was in 2017. And we knew that the 40th anniversary of opening and reform was coming up. So we took it upon ourselves this task of trying to figure out whether China would continue to be the economic juggernaut. Could what China has done in the past 40 years, would it continue? Was there going to be a new model coming online if they were going to change their model? And so the approach that we took, and this really determined who we, how the authors were selected. And let me say also that, as with any volume, there are a lot of issues that we were not able to cover. And there are a lot of great authors out there, but, we decided to try to focus this as much as possible. And I think that perhaps the best way to convey our approach is to say that we wanted to examine the internal as well as the external context that facilitated China's economic growth. And, you know, looking at China, it was pretty clear that the demographic dividend was over and that future growth would depend on improvements in human capital, and health and elder care would require higher expenditures. And at the same time, we also, and Tom could say more about this, but the external environment also has changed radically over the last 40 years. Part of this is because of China's own behavior, but there's also to consider that, you know, China is not alone anymore in the sense that there's the rise of economic competitors that are actually determined to follow China's path. And then, of course, something that we're experiencing right now, increasing friction with the United States and other major economies. And so, you know, we've got this very changed demographic and economic situation. The miracle growth period we thought was pretty much over. And by the time we started this, there was already the acceptance of the new normal. Growth had already slowed. But in addition to this, we also had a sense that the challenges that China's leaders were facing domestically were also changed in the sense that the demands from the population were increasing. I think we have to realize that something like 70% of the population has only known high growth rates and with that high expectations. And so together, I think the Chinese people, foreign firms, other governments are demanding more and they're less patient. And so, you know, with those type of challenges, you know, we, and let me just want one more. And something else that is very different and something that is very recent has to do with the rise of the internet. How effectively is China going to be able to control the internet, social media? Because here is the one sort of new outlet for people to vent their demands and frustrations. And so with all this is just, you know, some of the challenges. And then the other part of our task was, well, what are China's leaders doing to address these challenges? And let me just stop here, and then maybe we can talk about what they're doing a bit more, and then I'll just turn it over to Tom to add to that. Steve, yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, but at some point, I'm going to talk about kind of how you chose the issues that you chose. What, in fact, did you not put in the book? In other words, I found it very thorough, and that these issues really laid out a substantial percentage of the issues that I think about every day in thinking about China's future. But Tom, or do you want
to? Steve, thank you for hosting this discussion. It's wonderful to do an activity with the National Committee. My involvement goes back 55 years, I guess, with the National Committee.
Yikes.
That the question
even longer than Jan's.
Well, right from the beginning with Jan. The kind of overarching questions to build on what Jean said. You know, what's China going to be like in the future, and how will it act, internally and externally, in the context of probably a majority of commentary extrapolating from past economic performance, and as Jean said, China as a juggernaut that would continue on with extremely high rates of growth and would act in ways commensurate with, take your pick, its ideology, its economic strength, its major power status. And we were quite dissatisfied with mechanistic interpretations that China would do this, act in that way, evolve in a particular way for reasons of history, for reasons of ideology, for reasons of economic scale. And we wanted to get at some of the concrete problems that China faces now and will face. And we decided to do that by digging into a relatively small number of what we considered critical challenges: education, healthcare, an aging population, the need to maintain or perhaps expand a very expensive military relationship with its neighbors, sustaining economic growth at a level that would meet rising expectations and rising requirements of a more modern population. We didn't have expectations about how it would turn out. We were not looking to assemble chapters that proved China's unstoppable evolution into something, or that China would collapse. And indeed, we pretty early on ruled out both straight line projections of the juggernaut or the wheels fall off and China becomes a flailing or failing state. What was of interest was that vast middle ground of muddling through, of coping, of sequencing actions, of coordinating actions across policy areas so that education policy fit technological explanations, fit desire to move up the sophistication of production, that fit with military capabilities and the like. That when we invited people to participate, to contribute to this, one of the initial framing questions they asked us was, so you asked us to talk about the future. How far out? And we said, you tell us, what's the relevant time scale in the area that you know more than we do? And in the event, most took a kind of a 10 to 15 year timeline because nothing's going to change terribly quickly. Let me end with saying we put the title on after we had assembled the study, when we recognized how important the choices that will be made by political leaders are, and the variety and the significance of the pressures that they're going to have to respond to. Some of them relating to development, modernization, some of them to the changing nature of the population, some to the consequences of 2 generations of 1 child per couple, so that there's nobody to stay and take care of grandma, you need more facilities. We'd be delighted to respond to questions about specific components that are in there. What we included was a experientially informed notion of what the interesting questions were, what the difficult problems were, what our Chinese colleagues were grappling with. And on the international dimension, the changes, as Jean pointed out, in the international context. As China now must operate in an environment that is much less receptive, automatically supportive of Chinese efforts, more reactive, more cautious, and above all, a whole lot more competition. Because when China started reform and opening, it was the first, and it turned out to be the only country that was kind of allowed to enter the free world candy store without having to change a political system, without having to become an ally. That engagement predicated on, if China's going to be our partner in the never-ending Cold War, better to have a strong partner than a weak partner. But that had changed. And now, the collapse of the Soviet Union, China's success, you've got, give or take, 150 countries that had some variant of Stalinist economic models that want to now emulate China's trajectory of modernization by following export-led growth, by participating in the rules-based order. And they use China as a model for how they can become competitors of China.
Just sort of add to what Tom is saying, and this, Steve, may actually give you a little more insight into sort of how we chose the chapters, the topics, and the authors. We, in a sense, you might say, we wanted to explain the variation in reform, and that China, we started out with the fact that they've done amazingly well, but there are some areas that were reformed more than others. And the other thing that we realized, and this in part draws from my own work, is that it's quite clear that China, although some people may not realize this, that China has actually gone a long way with only tweaking the institutions that they inherited when they started reform in the late 70s. And we thought that was very interesting. And so there was the question of, well, is it really the case that they don't have to change the system? And they could just keep going on and being this economic juggernaut? Or is there some point when they're going to have to make deeper institutional change? And for me, at least, I picked topics. I wanted to see what happens in those areas where they have refused to let go of what one would think would be outdated institutions, including things like the household registration system, the hukou system. What happens when and how does that system then complicate the decisions that they have to make? Because as the chapters in Mary Gallagher's chapter makes very clear, this hukou system is not just about about who gets to have land and who doesn't, but it's the question about what kind of treatment migrants get in the cities. But something that people don't realize is that this hukou system also affects the way that different cities are receptive to the migrants, because it affects the way they get their budgetary allocations. Yeah. So we really wanted a deep dive into...
Yeah, so exactly, so that's precisely what the book does. So you would say the hukou system, which I guess we expected to be basically abolished at some point.
Right.
It has been modified.
It has been modified.
The hukou system of when I first started living in China in 1979 is not the hukou system of today. So is that kind of, you think of that as tinkering on the edges, but maintaining the institution?
The hukou system has been modified, and in some of the smaller cities, the hukou system is not that important. But in the mega cities, the old system in many ways is still in effect. And to the point where because this gets into some detail, but I think it's sort of interesting that having worked with some people in NDRC, for example, they readily acknowledge that they are not actually able to change the hukou system. And so when they talk about urbanization, the rates of urbanization are actually much higher than the actual changes in the number of people who actually have hukou, urban hukou. They're counted as urban hukou, but they don't have urban hukou. So there's still two classes of citizens. This is why we had this chapter that looks into how different localities are trying to deal with the question of who should actually be given a legal hukou, because that still affects their rights and their income and everything else.
Tom, did you want to add something?
I was going to add another kind of illustrative of the depth that you were pointing to, Steve, that having an urban hukou is the basis for eligibility to free education, to healthcare or levels of healthcare, to being able to hook up to urban gas and water and sewer lines, worker compensation, disability, retirement, pensions, all are linked there. That in the way that they are currently distributed largely through workplace. If you grant urban hukou to migrant workers, but don't expand the size of the pie that is to be developed, you're taking money and opportunities and benefits away from existing workers, existing urban residents. So you've got a financial development that here, and the converse in the rural areas, with people now reluctant to give up rural hukou in some areas because the value of land is great. And if they're working in the cities, they can rent it out to some even poorer farmer. And that's fixed. That is a certainty, whereas urban life is still pretty uncertain. How much of the healthcare do you pay for?
Last question on hukou, then I want to go on to a bunch of others. But what percentage of the population lives in urban areas where hukou is still restricted? So Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, the big top tier cities. What's the percentage of the total population that lives in those areas? Do we know?
Gosh, I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue. I'm sure Karen Eggleston could tell me, but she's not on the call. Tom, do you know?
I don't. The percentage of the population classified as urban is now slightly over 50%, with a goal of becoming 70% within a few more years. And there, in the plan, there are numbers per year of those who are migrants to be converted into urban hukou. They've fallen far behind that in there, because with the economic slowdown and now the COVID disruption of the economy, there isn't the money to fund it.
But is this one, I guess I said we'd move on, but is this one where we don't give China enough credit for really fundamentally changing this system? When I first lived in China, when you graduated from the university, you would be fun paid to a place. Right. You would be, what would you call it in English? Fun paid, just sent. Assigned. Yeah, just assigned to a place, and you got hukou in that place. Now, you choose it yourself, you can work there, your employer can ultimately obtain, if you work a number of years, pay taxes, your employer can ultimately obtain hukou. Isn't that kind of fundamentally a different system?
Well, first I want to make sure that the audience understands, because one of the arguments that we make is that, the easy reforms have been done. And I want to stress that there has been significant change across the system, and they have tackled very difficult problems, including things like laying off workers. And the changes that you point to, Steve, yes, they are very real. People are not as, they're not so easily assigned, and not as many people are just assigned their position. But technically, on things like if you are from the countryside and you have a peasant house, rural household registration, technically, you're not supposed to be in the rural areas. People do it, and they've been able to do it ever since the markets opened. But that is why when the different cities decide to, quote, clean them up, they could very legitimately send them away. So yes, there's been some change, but at the same time, this old institution is only sort of been changed around the edges. So it's still there.
As we saw in Beijing, they moved out, 1 million people who didn't have hukou. I mean, it was quite stunning to see. I should tell the audience, I see we have Q&A that, if you want to ask a question, just go on the bottom of your screen is the Q&A function. You can ask a question that way. I see that Carl Eikenberry, who is the author of the chapter on military modernization in the book, is on this call. So Carl, if you want to type something into the Q&A, we will certainly read it. Back to the book for a moment. Jean, you talk, it's a beautiful example of kind of central local government relations, and that it shows you know, there's a view in the United States is like, they say the Chinese government. And I always go, what do you mean the Chinese government? It depends which agency. It depends, do you mean state? Do you mean local? Do you mean national? Which, I mean, it's amazing. So you use the local debt crisis as a kind of a deep dive to understand this. Can you talk, number one, about what that teaches you about central-local relations? And two, there's a lot written out this debt crisis, the local debt crisis, being an existential threat to China's financial system, and then talk about that as you look out 5 or 10 years.
Okay. One of the reasons why I chose to focus on central local relations, and this sort of gets to your initial point, Steve, that, you know, I think a lot of people assume that the central state is all powerful. And, you know, it's unified and such, but it's far from the truth. And I would also assert that the growth that China has experienced, it would not have enjoyed that without the active participation of local cadres, the local state. Those who are familiar with my work know about that. This is sort of a theme I've been pursuing for quite a while. So the reason why I then chose to look at this is in trying to answer the question of what China will be like is, what is the relationship between the localities and the center, i.e., will they continue to be their entrepreneurial selves? Will they have the incentives to pursue economic growth? Or have there been new circumstances that will intervene and cause actually the old model that got China this far not to work? And maybe Xi Jinping has decided that he doesn't like that model. That's fine, but he then has to tell us what's he gonna do instead. And so I picked this local government debt because it is like it's just an incredible window into the complexity of this relationship between the center and the localities. On the one hand, if you look into the details of the fiscal relationship between the center and the localities, you see one where the center is continually blaming the localities for local government debt. And this is where the anti-corruption campaign comes in. And that's sort of one of the new factors that has been injected into the situation. And so for me, that was like a perfect opportunity to ask, well, is this really the right medicine for Xi Jinping and the center to use to try to, you know, tamp down this local debt? And what I find is that a lot of this local debt is actually, I would argue, the direct result of central policies, i.e. the fiscal system, which was created since 1994 in such a way that left the localities systemically short of revenue. That they just put that system just created debt. And the really interesting question then becomes, well, why do local officials go along with this? And the answer is, well, they have political ambition and they're going to get ahead. And if they're going to get ahead, they need to come up with a solution. And so they have. And the solution is to borrow. But what's really interesting, and I've got another piece that I'm actually working on now, that talks about how, again, this was with the consent of Beijing and specifically Zhurongji, that Zhurongji, in order to get 1994 reforms passed, said to the localities, okay, you know, you guys can go off and earn this different revenue to make up for the losses from 1994. And so that was sort of the start of this. And this went on very nicely and was manageable until the global financial crisis. And that then really spiked the amount of debt that the localities had to borrow. But the real crisis, and you ask, is this an existential crisis? Well, I think that up until then, it was manageable. And it actually was manageable until this debt that was, this huge debt that was undertaken started coming due in around 2012, just about the time that Xi Jinping came in. And with that, he then decides, okay, this is getting a little too risky, because local governments are engaging in all sorts of things to try to get more money, including shadow banking, mechanisms and such. And so you turn into a situation where what was once legal, not legal, wasn't illegal, it was condoned into something that is now turned into a negative for locality.
You mentioned in the article that this bonus system that existed for local officials. Can you talk about that and what's really, how that has evolved now to potentially being illegal?
Okay, yes. Part of the reason why, and this goes back to my work on TVEs, that starting in 1980, one of the reasons why local cadres were so entrepreneurial is that it became legal for them to keep all this extra revenue that they generated, and then localities could use that revenue for bonuses for individual cadres, individual bureaus, and so it was like a win-win situation for them. And so one of the things that's happened, and this is what I say, and this is I worry about this, is that with the recent anti-corruption campaign, there's also efforts to say no more bonuses, none of these perks that came with being a local official. And so local officials, because of this anti-corruption campaign, they're really scared. When you watch your colleagues being dragged off the stage after having given a major speech, you think, and so perhaps it's best not to be so entrepreneurial, but instead just sit on your hands. And talking to people in the know and some local officials, it's a much sort of riskier proposition to really use all of the entrepreneurial tools that local officials had in the past. This is why my question, and I end the chapter with this, is, the problem is systemic. The problem is institutional. They've got to reform the fiscal system. But if they keep going after local cadres, the question is, will this impede their ability to get these folks to really be active in pushing the growth that's necessary?
Last question, then on this issue, then I want to go to Tom and his chapter in the book. But we've all studied China a long time, and we've seen not only post-49 China, but pre-1911 China, this centralization, localization, centralization, local. Is that just what we're seeing here again?
Definitely. This is one of the key themes that Tom and I, try to stress, that it's re-centralization. And we use the term, we haven't brought this term up yet, but I want to make sure. So, this question about, well, what is the regime doing to try to address these challenges? Are they pushing forward in reform, or are they doing something else? And in the end, Tom and I, we had some doubts about this, but in the end, we think this is the best characterization, is they're going back to the future. And this going back to the future is re-centralization, tightening in controls, investing in ideology rather than deep institutional change. So they're using slogans like, look in the mirror and take a bath. We haven't heard this for a long time. So yes, this is what I think is happening. And I think that this idea about centralization, re-centralization, it's this pendulum that swings back and forth over the many years that we've been studying China. Yeah. And clearly it is swung back to centralization.
Centralization, yeah. Tom, in addition to helping edit the book, wrote a chapter in the book which is called Sources and Shapers of China's Foreign Policy. And if I were to summarize it, there is continued consistency in China's foreign policy. That this idea that we've seen a new China that's totally different from what we saw over the past 40 years is probably not right. First, tell me if that would be a reasonably accurate summary, and then tell us, what does it mean if your analysis is right? You've spent your life till you came back to Stanford working in intelligence. What does this mean for how we should formulate US policy towards China?
Yeah, well, you did read it correctly. And
I passed. I was always worried about passing.
It's linked to the domestic portions of the book is the observation, to me, the reality that foreign policy in any country, certainly in China, doesn't float off there by itself. It's an intrinsic element of national policy. And for China after 78, development, modernization, sustained economic growth in order to provide for the people, to enhance legitimacy for the party state, was priority number one. So the duty of foreign policy was to facilitate that, to maintain security, reduce threats, manage threats, but also to create and exploit opportunities for an economic relationship, cultural relationships, people to people. And that concentrated on the United States, on the OECD countries more broadly, that like Willie Sutton's, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why did China deal with the most developed countries? Because that's what had the technology, the capital, the training, the markets that China needed to pursue the South Korean, Taiwan path of export-led growth. That when China embarked upon this path, it was almost as if they had read George Washington's farewell address on avoiding entangling alliances and commitments. That they wanted to minimize as much as possible the extent to which they became enmeshed in, vulnerable to, dependent on this broader international situation. Wanted to counterbalance dependence on the United States with relationship with Europe and Japan. Wanted to counterbalance the security challenge of the then Soviet Union with a better relationship with the United States. All of these pieces kind of fit together. That remembering back to the early days of reform and opening, there were regular good-natured exchanges with Chinese who were going to basically take advantage of the international system to jumpstart China's ability to have independent, sustained growth. And I characterized at the time as get in, get rich, get out. And the Chinese tried to do that for many years, and the smiling response of Americans was good luck. That your success will depend on your engagement in the system. And the more successful you are, the more deeply involved, the bigger your stake in the system. That long antedates Bob Zoellick raising the responsible stakeholder idea. The link to the other part of the book is that for China, since roughly 2008, and I think it links more to the global financial crisis than to personalities, but China begins to be more concerned about maintaining domestic stability as growth is beginning to slow and the prospect is for more slow and needing more control, less vulnerability to interference and disruption on the outside. It begins not in broad compass, but in selected ways to be more assertive as it's characterized, to try to be more independent, but it doesn't work for China. And as growth is slowed, the recognition that in order to manage all of these domestic challenges, in order to meet the rising expectations and demands of Chinese people, in order to pay for the now very expensive military that Carl describes in his chapter, in order to sustain the commitments made under Belt and Road, that China has to keep growing. And the only way to keep growing is to continue to work with and within the rules-based order. Now, China doesn't like certain aspects of that order, the degree of US dominance being one, and it wants changes to the order, but it doesn't want to throw the order out. Yeah. So the degree to which China's own domestic interest and legitimacy and ability to deliver on promises it's made to the Chinese people about when it becomes a high-income country and the like, require that it maintain pretty good relationships with other major economic players.
Mm-hmm. So how would you answer, Natasha Locke from Yenching Academy asks a question, which poses the biggest concern to the Chinese government today, getting exactly at the question that you're addressing, protecting its internal domestic legitimacy or maintaining external international relationships. And what you're saying is they're complementary, not conflicting.
Yeah, they're two sides of the same coin. That I would put the internal stability, legitimacy first, which is probably the case with all countries. China's not unique in that regard. But the two most important pillars, the two most important pillars of legitimacy are domestic economic performance and patriotism, nationalism, the mythology that has grown up around sovereignty and defense of China's interests. That makes it necessary, in my analysis, for China's leaders to take a less compromising position on anything that is easily construed as an affront to Chinese sovereignty. Otherwise, they risk internal criticism for no longer standing up for China.
Jean, anything you want to add on that point?
No, it's just, the only thing is just to highlight the BRI, because we have 3 chapters on BRI and 3 excellent chapters. And this is the question of, on the one hand, China is trying to use external relations, you might say, but it is a very costly, it's very expensive, particularly when they're making big commitments. And then the question now of, given COVID and the collapse of a lot of these economies, what is this going to do with all of the demands for the limited budget? China's, wealthy, but I mean, it's got a lot of money, but still, when you have all these different demands, that is only going to complicate matters. And there's already some indication that some in China are wondering, why are you spending all this money building infrastructure abroad when we need it at home? Just very similar to, issues that we have here in the US, actually.
Tom, I take slight issue with all countries have the same kind of view of maintaining their legitimacy, maintaining the rule of the ruling party. I would argue that China's is particularly acute compared to OECD countries, Japan, Korea, the United States. And that, it reminds me of a friend who was the national security advisor of China, or was head of the leading group on foreign affairs. And he said to me, you got to always remember that at this President Obama was president. Now, maybe different under President Trump, but President Obama gets up in the morning and first thing he gets is his intelligence briefing, which briefs him on Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Venezuela. Xi Jinping gets up in the morning and he gets briefed on Wuhan, Chengdu, right, Lhasa, Urumqi. It's very different, and the whole psychology, therefore, is very different.
Yeah, thank you for the question, which underscores I did not make myself clear. That the word I thought I used was maintain the stability of the regime, which in China happens to be a party state. In the United States, it happens to be functionally a 2-party democracy. So in other countries, it's not to maintain, or not necessarily to maintain the ruling party's position. It's to maintain the political system that allows the economy to function, that allows for democracy to be practiced, that allows for states or lower levels of the system to have whatever degree of autonomy they have. So thank you for the chance to clarify.
Right.
That's the common element. The unique one in China is the degree to which the party is the state.
And here, let me just add one bit here, because this is one of the complicating factors for their reform. I think people sort of have pushed aside the idea that ideology matters. But in many ways and at many times, this factor, this ideology, this idea of socialism, I think comes in and complicates the choices that the leadership can make. That's why some of the reforms have moved much more slowly than others, specifically the reform of the SOE sector. It was very difficult for them to restructure the SOEs to the limited degree that they have.
Yeah.
And it's going to be much harder to really to go even further.
Is it socialism or is it control? Because the organization department appoints the head of an SOE. And if you are worried about controlling an enterprise, if you appoint the head of it as somebody who spent his life owning companies, that's a good way to control it.
I actually think that there's certainly the control element, but I think that the ideology and the socialism still matters. And throughout the reform period, some top leaders have actually criticized the reformers for going too far and too fast because they were no longer adhering to the principles of socialism, including things like, making giving managers the ability to buy SOEs. So it's tough. They haven't jettisoned ideology. Let's put it this way: it's a useful tool, but it's also something that they can't just totally ignore.
Let me elaborate on that, or complicate it a little bit, with two of the leitmotifs or the shaping constraints that run through the book, or shape possibilities. One is, China's very, very impressive growth over 30 plus years, and not through the 40 years, but over 30 plus years. It's only slightly longer than the other Asian tigers before it levels off. It's not as unique as the Chinese claim it to be, unique and unprecedented. But what is unique is, of the rapidly modernizing states, only one has leveled off and then begun to decline before it reached high income status, and that's China. And it's more than a symbolic importance to be able to claim I am a high income country, that it brings with it a greater capacity, a fiscal capacity, to manage the challenges that come with higher levels of development. The other...
When you said decline, what did you mean, Tom? Decline?
Rate of growth is what I'm talking about. Yeah. On this. And so much of China's self-image, so much of the external image is predicated on decades of double-digit growth, which aren't coming back. The adjustment to the normal. The other constraint that has emerged during the period of reform and opening is an entrenched elite. That Mao, for all of the disruptions he caused, he did eliminate entrenched interest, bureaucratic interest, individual interest. Now, there is basically a single power elite in China that has a very clear personal as well as ideological interest in maintaining the system from which they benefit disproportionately. And further reform is less of a good idea, because further reform jeopardizes the basis of their wealth and power. And I think that's one of the things that kicked in the Hu Jintao era.
Which leads to this question from Albert Goldson of the Overseas Press Club. To what extent is the anti-corruption campaign utilized strictly for political purposes, purges, versus actual fiscal malfeasance. Either of you want to take that one?
Sure, let me start. So Andrew Wiedemann has got a very detailed chapter that looks at this, because a big debate. And I have to say that, you know, I think there's still debate, but I think that Andrew Wiedemann comes down and makes a pretty convincing case that it is not just for you know, political purposes, i.e. Xi going after his enemies. But at the same time, you know, is it just for actual fiscal malfeasance? Well, you know, there is that, and there has been quite a large number of people who have been charged, sentenced and such for some issues. So it's actually been a multi-purpose tool. And the other thing about it is that it seems to just keep going on. And most recently, it's expanded to the security, to the security sector. I think this past week. So it's I don't know. It's it could just also be evolving, but at least the work that we have, it's not just for political reasons. Tom, did you want to add?
And of course, you know, one of the many dilemmas for China's leaders, there is unquestionably a great deal of corrupt activity, illicit activity in China. At times, it has been functionally useful. The system is imperfect. The system's got lots of flaws and gaps. And in order to get things done, there's been a wide scope for figure out how to do it and don't tell me. I don't need to know, just get it done. And that now has been put at risk. It's in this entrepreneurial behavior category that Jean talked about. That Wiedemann's chapter basically says the numbers being charged and prosecuted, and removed in the Xi Jinping anti-corruption are not significantly different than those of earlier anti-corruption campaigns. They involve more high-level people in there, but the numbers are not significantly different. In all of them, there are a small percentage of those who would be vulnerable to prosecution. So crackdown on some is a demonstration, kill the chicken to scare the monkey kind of phenomenon. But as Jean indicated earlier, it has the unintended consequence of stifling elements of entrepreneurial behavior that were rewarded in the past and now might get you in trouble.
Yeah, I think the biggest change, though, was exactly what you made reference to, Tom, which is the raising, the going to high-level people that, you know, formerly members of the Standing Committee and the Politburo had what I guess I would call immunity. And that clearly has changed, and especially with the fall of Zhou Yongkang and others.
Who was for a couple of years my counterpart.
Right. So quite senior. Halsey Beamer, who's been at this for a few years too, asks, given the substantial recent COVID-19 impact on China's GDP growth and the fundamental budget financial background needs for all of the fateful decisions, referring to your book, how do we see the near future for China?
Well, let me start, and let me just go straight to this question about local government debt, which is, you know, one of the big questions. And they actually made some changes in the last couple of years before COVID, where they're trying to get rid of some of what they call backdoor financing, i.e., you know, shadow banking, but also sort of using these local government financial vehicles to raise money. And they have moved to issuing government-approved bonds. that would make debt more observable, controllable, and under the thumb of higher level authorities. But I think that with COVID, I mean, this is something that we don't yet have all the information, but it was at least pretty clear early on in sort of January, February, that the quotas that they issued for the bonds was quickly being, exhausted. So I think that I would predict that they're probably going to be a little more lenient. They're going to have to let governments go back to using whatever methods they can to raise enough money to take care of their local needs. So there is that, but then there's all these other demands. So Tom, why don't you take it from there?
And Halsey, thank you for tuning in. We were grad school together. The concern about debt that Jean referred to and is real, that China did not, in response to COVID, use the dump huge amounts of money into the system to do more infrastructure and other capital investment kinds of things, because they recognize it's not very helpful anymore. But they also did not dump money into the system as subsidies to the give or take 200 million migrants who went home to their local place, rural migrants who had to eat into savings for basic sustenance and rely on relatives. And there's no indication that they will ever be compensated in some way. They just had to eat it. A very traditional Chinese or any other economic system that's less than very advanced and very rich. So most of those will go back to work eventually. It'll impede the transition to a consumer-based economy because of uncertainty about who's going to pay for elder care, health care, education for kids, for give or take half the population of the country. People have incentives to save. If you're saving for all of these things and now have to make up for a deficit and have to save more because the pandemic has demonstrated fragility of the system, that's going to slow the transition to a consumer-based economy, which will probably also contribute to the slowdown of economic growth.
Let's go back to the book for a sec and talk about the lessons. I know there are a lot of chapters in the book, but what are the lessons for U.S.-China relations as opposed to China's development, which a lot of it is talking about? What lessons should we draw from the book about U.S.-China relations?
Well, I'll start with some, and Jean can add to them. One is decoupling is not really feasible and would be a big mistake to try and do for either side. And I would argue that the Chinese have done more to decouple than the United States has. Trump administration has made more gongs and cymbals about it. But China's ability to manage these challenges, as I said earlier, depends on its continued participation in a globalized system. I think they understand that. I think that creates opportunities for cooperation, necessity to overcome some of the short-term but very real differences that exist. A second is to move beyond worst-case imagination of a China as a diabolical authoritarian regime hell-bent on displacing the United States and transforming the rules-based order into something else. I don't see it. That the lessons are for their own self-interest. They need a well-functioning international order, stability in the order, for all of the military buildup, for all of the attention to Belt and Road. Beijing understands they are not remotely in a position to assume primary responsibility for system maintenance, provision of public goods in the system. They need order, and therefore they need the United States, among others, to contribute to preservation of that order. So we should not, in US policy, overreact to our worst imagination, about what China could be. We also should not anticipate that China is going to collapse, or that if China changed its political system and became a democracy tomorrow, that it would act fundamentally different in the international arena. It's still going to act like China. It's still going to act like a big country. It's still going to act like a big middle income country with large aspirations and a demanding public. That we don't have to be extraordinarily smart, I think, to manage a China that's likely to stumble. We're going to deal with a China that is, confidence is uncertain, path ahead is uncertain. It's going to be experimenting and trying to solve these things and a little forward and step back. We're going to have to cut them some slack and avoid being stupid.
Gene, for you, let me add a little to that question, but ask basically the same. And it's added by Minye, who's a public intellectual of the National Committee and an associate professor at BU, asking, how does the U.S.-China breakdown, decoupling, affect your assessment of domestic change in China?
Before I answer that question, I just want to add that one of the lessons, and actually one of the goals of our book, is to, in a sense, is to elaborate what Tom was saying, that, China, there is domestic politics, and these leaders are facing incredibly, complex challenges. And so the whole book was about, why they haven't done a lot of the reforms. And so I guess one of the lessons is, it's not as easy as simply saying, well, you can just, they should just level the playing field, and deal with so basically get rid of SOEs. Those are not easy decisions, and so a lot of these institutions are interlinked. And so we just want to highlight that there is complexity to the system, the challenges, that change is not as easy as one might think. Now, in terms of Minya's question.
But Gene, can we go back to that for one
yes.
second? Yeah, when we talk about SOEs, I have for a long time, partly because I dealt with SOEs over a good part of my career, I have for a long time believed we will see SOE reform, because basically their productivity is so inferior to the productivity of the private sector that the leadership is going to decide, as we're seeing what Tom said is this decreasing rate of growth, we got to find a way to kind of increase it. And one of, actually for them, for the Chinese leadership, low-hanging fruit is SOE reform in sectors where the government doesn't need to have total control.
Right.
I mean, do you really need SOEs in cement and steel?
Definitely.
In oil? I mean, no.
This is one of the actually, I wish we would have had a detailed chapter on SOE reform. I just want to stress, and I've been following SOE reform for quite a while. And if I had time, we could go back, and the leadership, the central leadership, and the local leadership, they all realize the inefficiencies, and they have been wanting to reform SOEs for the longest time. They've been wanting to do this since reforms first started.
Yeah.
But they keep running into problems. So for example, what you just said, they would love to get rid of a lot of firms that are still considered SOEs, but for various reasons, they've been unable to. And some of these reasons are that, so when they do it, there's charges of asset stripping and various other things, going against socialism. And so, yeah, it might look like low-hanging fruit, but boy, it's almost like forbidden fruit. So, it's tough. This is the one area. And very recently, I think that you're correct. They are trying to reform it. They've come up with this incredibly complex system of trying to now put different SOEs in different categories, and some of them supposedly are able to compete in the market fully, and others they're saying, no, 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 you know, we still realize you've got to sort of help government plans and such. It's still all very murky about what actually is happening to that sector, but it's something to follow. But it's not for the lack of not wanting to. Clearly, certainly she is saying SOEs are going to remain a central part. Yep. But I think within that phrase, there is actually quite a bit of change. And then, to Minya's question, how does decoupling, how is it going to affect the political economy?
In China, yeah.
In China. Well, I think that China is anticipating this. And actually, in some ways, I think that because of all the actions that have been taken internationally, China is starting to put more resources in those areas where the links are going to be broken and they're going to have to rely on themselves. And in actual interviews with some Chinese corporations as well as multinationals, I get the same sense that people are already starting to anticipate this. And so they're starting to diversify, firms are starting to diversify. So I think that we're just going to perhaps here, let me bring in Barry Naughton's chapter about grand steerage, that the central authorities, this is where they're gonna, I think, perhaps try to make use of those SOEs and try to get them more efficient, and then to inject money into certain key sectors, particularly in the tech sector, such as chip making and such, where they're going to be denied access to American products. So there's going to be more, perhaps, focused state support for certain industries.
Steve, let me, if I may, kind of expand upon my, U.S. should cut China some slack by what I mean by that. That not construing everything that Chinese undertake or talk about undertaking as inherently inimical to American interest and diabolical in intent. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which turns out to be a pretty good way to get more capital into the system. Belt and Road, most of it's not going to happen. We shouldn't get overexcited about tying this together. Why would we think it would work any better than dollar diplomacy did for the United States or yen diplomacy did for Japan? And focusing on the real issues in the relationship: theft of intellectual property, non-compliance with WTO and other treaty commitments, the forced technology transfer. Most of them are in the economic field, but one of them that is not is in military, in strategic systems. That China's refusal to participate in any type of arms control discussions with Russia and the United States because it has fewer weapons. That's hazardous both for danger of misperception and accidents, but also because China is pursuing advanced systems now that without agreement to manage them will lead to an arms race with both the United States and the Russians, which will be extraordinarily expensive for all of us. And this is sort of the United States needs to do a better job of making clear where it is in mutual interest to work together and get off of this. You got to gain trust first. You've got to improve the atmosphere before we can solve real problems. We've got to keep pushing on that.
Agree. Peggy Blumenthal has a question, which is, I think, very good for both of you. As the CCP, and especially Jean, who's also head of the Stanford Center at PKU, as the CCP tightens control over universities, will this imperil the academic excellence and research success of its top-tier university and result in decoupling in the US-China joint research and academic partnership? I would also add my own kind of other side of that question is the US government policy today going to result in a diminution of American academic excellence?
Well, let me just start by saying that that is actually a major concern, the first part of the question. And it has been for the last at least couple of years. And talking to colleagues in China, we do know that there are more controls on the teaching materials that they use in their own classes. Whether it is going to affect what American institutions do, American students and faculty, again, that's a major concern. And I can only speak for myself and our center, but so far we have been, I think, quite fortunate that we have been able to do the programming that we set out to do. What is going to happen in the future, I don't know, but I have to say that I'm reacting to your second part. I'm also very concerned about, equally concerned, if not more, about some of the actions by the U.S. Agencies, whether that might be an overreaction. So we need to be careful on both sides. Tom?
Yeah, I think to Peggy's question, there are no advantages to either side, certainly not to the United States. Of interpreting reciprocity, if they do stupid things, we do stupid things. That gets us nowhere. But why would any sane person want to cut off 17% of the world's brain power in tackling the very large number of complex international challenges that we have, or domestic challenges in both places? That we need access to the Chinese, and though we're only 4% of the world, in many areas we punch above our weight. The ability to work together makes it possible for third country participants to participate in all kinds of activities. That we live on the same spaceship Earth. We've got many, many interconnected interests. Some of these problems require cooperation. I think in the short term, the Chinese would be more disadvantaged than the Americans, in part because of the network that we have with many, many other countries. But long term, and longer term is not that long, we would begin to be disadvantaged if we can't work with Chinese colleagues. And that would spin off into business cooperative relations in all kinds of non-governmental associational group. If you haven't built those personal networks, personal familiarity that you carry over into all kinds of areas beyond the classroom and the laboratory, we all lose.
I'm afraid we are out of time, and I also think that's a perfect closing note. But Tom and Jean, I have thoroughly enjoyed this and could go on till midnight tonight. But this has given you a flavor of this book, Fateful Decisions, which really, for those who are interested in China, is just a must read, not only for Tom and Jean's chapters, but for all the other experts that have written these great chapters. And it's going to be a book that will be making an impact for a long time to come. But thank you both so much for all you have done over so many years for U.S.-China relations and for the committee. It's deeply appreciated, and thank you all for joining us. I see everyone stayed with us the whole time. So obviously they were mesmerized by both of you, and they will be equally mesmerized by the book. But thanks for joining us.
Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, very much.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.